So now the entire center of our quilt is done, and we've outlined both the inner and the outer border edges of that heavy upholstery braid, so all that's left is to quilt the area outside the center panel. Let's get back to the sewing machine and we'll show you some fun free motion quilting designs. The very first thing that must be done is to again outline all the various parts of any and all applique shapes with invisible thread. I won't spend much time on this since you already know how to do it, but know that whenever you are working with trapuntoed applique, it's important to always ground the design by outlining all of the applique before you start quilting a background fill design. So just as before, I've got monopoly invisible thread in my top needle, and I'm using a size 60/8 Microtex sharp needle as I work my way around all the individual parts of these applique shapes. What I want you to notice is that in one way, this kind of quilting is relatively easy because all the quilting is near the outside of the quilt, so I don't have to cram lots of bulky quilt into my throat space. On the other hand, though, this is a bit more challenging because that heavily trapuntoed center section is very dense and very heavy, and because it moves now as one large unit, I can't really drape it and puddle it on my extension table like I normally would do. Instead, it kind of pulls against me. Again, this is not at all insurmountable, but I'm pointing it out so you'll see what happens when you do this kind of extra heavy trapunto work. Once all of those applique shapes have been outlined with invisible thread, it's time to go in and add some kind of background fill design to that outer section. Now know that there are many, many, many different free motion quilting designs that would work really well in this area. I'm going to show you what I call a loose version of swirls. Let's get to it. Stitching swirls is fairly easy if you think of it as an innie and outie kind of design. What I mean by that is that any given swirl is formed by swirling into the center of the swirl and then swirling back out, and your goal is to never stitch back over a line that you've already stitched. The place where you may find yourself in trouble is in not having enough room to swirl your way back out, so always stitch the first part of the swirl large enough that you'll have enough space to stitch your way back out once you reverse direction. As I work, I am deliberately not stitching these in rows. My goal is to create a loose background fill design, and the reason I want it to be loose is that the quilting in the center panel is very dense, and I want this area to have a very different texture than the center panel. This quilt is all about texture, and quilting is another vehicle you can use to add another layer of texture to a quilt. As I approach applique shapes, space gets a bit tighter, but with a background fill design like this one, it's easy to simply work my way around all these applique structures and the embroidered curlicues. The key here is to work in a way that your work does not look crowded. Now I used this same swirl design for the 3 sides of the quilt that had applique work on them, and then I went back in and used feathers for the 4th side. I want you to know, though, there are many other ways that you can use swirls in designs. So let's take a second and I'll show you a couple of different ways you can use swirls, and then you'll begin to appreciate just how versatile swirls can be in free motion quilting. First, I want you to appreciate that swirls can look very different simply by virtue of how densely or loosely you stitch them. For example, on the quilt we've been working on, they were loose, which means that I deliberately spread them out so that there was some good space between them. Here, I'm stitching these swirls much more densely, and can you see how different the design looks? It's 2 very different designs, and all I've done here is to alter how closely together I'm stitching them. Here is yet another example of how you might alter a swirl design. In this case, I'm adding a pointy curved V shape between my swirls, and this is because I'm changing direction after each swirl. Again, this is a minor alteration of the stitch design, but it adds a new look to both of the swirl designs that we've just discussed. Now, so far, all the designs we've talked about are involving swirls where they're being stitched kind of randomly. What do you think would happen if we were very deliberate with regard to swirl placement and swirl size? This is an example of swirls being stitched in a row. Even though I'm stitching all of these out freehand, they look roughly symmetric because I'm using the edges of this border to guide me in determining the size of each swirl. Swirls are always a quick and easy way to dress up a narrow border, and they can be used in an identical fashion to stitch your way up the stem of a flower. There are all kinds of ways to use the swirl shape in free motion quilting, so let your imagination be your guide on this one. Now that is really just a taste of some of the designs you can make with swirls, so get yourself some scratch paper and start doodling away, and you'll see just how much fun they can be and the world of design possibilities that exist with swirls. Now when we meet again for the next tutorial, we're going to learn how to stitch feathers on that fourth side, so get ready for some real fun.